You've probably noticed it in small moments first. The strange shift that happens when you walk into a new room and suddenly become a slightly different version of yourself without meaning to. Around certain people, you're quieter. Around others, sharper, funnier, more guarded, more observant. And after enough years of this, a quiet question starts following you everywhere. Which one of these versions is actually me? Or worse, what if none of them are? There are people who walk into a room and remain almost entirely themselves. Their personality carries across environments with a kind of effortless continuity. The way they speak to coworkers is not dramatically different from the way they speak to friends. Their opinions stay relatively stable. Their energy feels internally anchored. And then there are people who shift. Not consciously, at least not at first. It happens quietly. Around one group, they become more careful with their words. Around another, more humorous, more agreeable, more restrained. Certain parts of their personality suddenly become louder while other parts disappear almost completely, as if the room itself has edited them before they've even had time to notice. What makes this exhausting is that none of these versions feel entirely fake. That's the confusing part. If you were pretending, the problem would probably feel simpler. But most people who constantly adjust themselves socially aren't inventing personalities out of thin air. They're revealing different fragments of themselves depending on what feels emotionally safe, useful, or acceptable in that particular environment. The serious version exists. The softer version exists too. So does the distant one, the observant one, the version that speaks less because something about the room quietly tells them not to unfold completely here. And after years of doing this, something subtle begins happening internally. You stop feeling like a person with a personality and start feeling more like a reflection shaped by proximity. Around confident people, you become quieter. Around emotionally expressive people, you open up more. Around judgmental people, parts of you retreat before you even consciously decide to hide them. Psychologists sometimes describe personality as partly relational, meaning different environments naturally activate different traits within us. But for highly adaptive people, this process becomes unusually intense. Their nervous system treats every social setting almost like new emotional terrain to navigate carefully, rather than simply exist within naturally. So instead of entering rooms as themselves, they enter rooms prepared to adjust. And most of the time, nobody notices how tiring that actually is. Some people can walk into a room and immediately feel the emotional temperature shift before a single conversation even begins. They notice who seems irritated, who holds quiet authority, who is trying too hard to be liked, who feels emotionally unavailable. None of this is necessarily conscious. Their brain simply absorbs social information automatically, almost the way certain people notice changes in lighting or background noise without meaning to. What's interesting is that this ability is often mistaken for confidence or charisma, when in reality it can come from something much more complicated. For many people, this habit of reading every room began long before adulthood, sometimes in households where moods changed unpredictably, where tension could appear suddenly without explanation, where knowing what version of yourself was safest became emotionally important. You learn, very early, that every environment has invisible rules. Certain emotions are welcomed. Others create distance. And slowly, without realizing it, your nervous system becomes highly attentive to shifts in tone, expression, silence, posture. Not because you're manipulative, because adaptation once felt necessary. Psychologists occasionally connect this kind of hyper-awareness to heightened social monitoring, a pattern where the brain becomes unusually focused on anticipating reactions before they happen. But in everyday life, it doesn't feel clinical. It feels like instinct. You walk into a conversation already calculating things nobody else seems to notice, whether your joke will land, whether your opinion will change the atmosphere, whether honesty is safe here, or whether this room rewards performance more than sincerity. And over time, this creates a strange contradiction. You become very good at understanding people, while becoming increasingly disconnected from yourself in the process. Because when your attention is constantly directed outward, monitoring emotional currents, adjusting your behavior, predicting responses, there's very little space left to ask a quieter question underneath all of it. What would I naturally say or do if I stopped trying to manage the room first? The unsettling part is that many socially adaptive people don't realize how much energy this takes until they're finally alone. Until the performance ends for a moment and they feel the emotional exhaustion underneath it. Not dramatic exhaustion, not collapse. Just the deep fatigue that comes from spending years translating yourself into versions that fit comfortably inside other people's expectations. At first, being adaptable can feel like a strength. You become the person who gets along with almost everyone. Different groups trust you easily. Conversations rarely feel difficult. You know how to soften tension, how to match energy, how to become whatever version of yourself keeps the interaction flowing smoothly. And because these adjustments happen so naturally, you rarely question them in the moment. But after enough years, something stranger begins happening beneath the surface. The boundaries between adaptation and identity start dissolving. You begin noticing small inconsistencies that are difficult to explain to anyone else. Around certain people, you talk endlessly. Around others, you become almost invisible. Some environments make you feel intelligent and expressive, while others shrink you into someone unusually quiet and uncertain. There are interests you openly share with one group, but almost hide from another. Opinions that exist clearly in private but somehow weaken in public. Entire emotional tones that appear or disappear depending on who's nearby. And none of it feels fully intentional. That's what makes it unsettling. Because eventually, you realize different people are carrying completely different versions of you in their minds. Your coworkers know one personality. Childhood friends know another. Family sees a version shaped years ago that may no longer even fit who you are now. And somewhere between all these shifting reflections, it becomes harder to locate a stable internal center beneath them all. Psychologists sometimes describe identity as partly constructed through social interaction. Human beings are relational by nature. Different environments genuinely pull different traits out of us. But when adaptation becomes constant, the self can start feeling fragmented instead of flexible. Less like one person with emotional range, and more like several unfinished versions stitched together loosely depending on context. This is why some people secretly feel disoriented after social situations, even good ones. They leave conversations replaying not just what they said, but who they became while saying it. And over time, a quiet fear starts forming underneath all of this. If every room changes me a little, then which version is actually mine when nobody else is around? What makes socially adaptable people difficult to understand is that they rarely look lonely from the outside. In fact, they often appear unusually socially capable. They can hold conversations with almost anyone. They know how to make people comfortable. They understand timing, tone, humor, emotional pacing. In group settings, they instinctively sense what version of themselves will fit most smoothly into the atmosphere. And because of that, other people usually experience them as easy to be around. But ease is not the same thing as closeness, and that distinction quietly becomes more painful over time. Because when you spend years adjusting yourself to match different emotional environments, you eventually realize most people are not connecting with your full self. They're connecting with the version of you that existed specifically around them. One group knows your thoughtful side, another only sees the funny version. Some people experience your confidence while others only know your caution. And the strange part is that all of these versions are technically real, which makes the loneliness harder to explain. You cannot point to a single false identity because none of them are entirely false. Still, something remains untouched underneath all of it. There's a particular kind of isolation that develops when your personality becomes too responsive to context. You start wondering whether people truly understand you, or simply understand the adaptation you offered them. Whether they would still feel connected to you if you stopped translating yourself into emotionally digestible forms all the time. This is why some highly adaptable people begin craving solitude in ways they don't fully understand. Not because they hate people, not because they want isolation, but because being alone becomes one of the only spaces where nothing needs adjusting. No emotional scanning, no unconscious calibration, no subtle editing happening in real time. For a little while, they can stop shaping themselves around the room and finally hear what their own thoughts sound like when nobody else's expectations are sitting beside them. At some point, people who constantly adapt begin to interpret their experience in a harsh way. They assume something must be wrong with them, that their personality is unstable, that they are inconsistent, confusing, or somehow less authentic than people who seem more fixed, more predictable, more the same everywhere they go. But this interpretation quietly misses something important about how human psychology actually works. Because what feels like inconsistency is often just responsiveness. Human beings are not static systems. They are deeply responsive to environment, tone, and social context. Different situations genuinely activate different parts of the self. The version of you that speaks softly in one room and more openly in another is not necessarily a contradiction. It is a reflection of how identity is partially relational by design. We don't just express ourselves into environments, we also absorb them. A calm room invites a different emotional rhythm than a tense one. A familiar space unlocks memories and ease that strangers do not. Even subtle cues, posture, silence, facial expression, perceived judgment, can shift how freely someone expresses themselves without them consciously deciding to change. From this perspective, adaptation is not a flaw in identity. It is one of its basic features. The difficulty begins when adaptation stops being a choice and starts becoming automatic. When you no longer notice the shift happening. When you lose contact with the underlying preferences that exist before adjustment begins. Not because they disappeared, but because they are constantly being overwritten in real time by social calibration. And this is where the reframe becomes important. The goal was never to become identical in every environment. That would not even be psychologically natural. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself in the process of adjusting. To notice when you are shifting and to ask whether the shift is necessary or simply habitual. Because beneath all the versions people carry of you, there is still something consistent. Not a fixed personality in the rigid sense, but a pattern of preferences, sensitivities, and internal reactions that remains recognizable if you pay attention long enough without interruption. And the more you begin to notice that underlying thread, the less confusing your variations start to feel. There comes a point where constantly adjusting yourself for every room starts to feel less like social intelligence and more like quiet exhaustion you can't fully name. Not because anything dramatic is happening. In fact, everything might look completely normal from the outside. You're still talking, still functioning, still showing up in conversations the way you always have. But internally, there's a subtle fatigue that builds from always translating yourself in real time. Translating tone, translating emotion, translating what is safe to express and what should be softened before it reaches other people. And the strange part is, most of it happens automatically. You don't consciously decide to become quieter in one room or more expressive in another. It just happens. A shift in energy, a slight recalibration, a version of you stepping forward, while another one quietly steps back without explanation. Over time, this creates a kind of internal habit. You begin monitoring yourself before you even realize you're doing it. Thinking about how you're coming across while you're still in the middle of being yourself, watching your words as they form, adjusting sentences mid-thought, editing personality in real time depending on who is present. It's not deception, it's adaptation without pause. But what makes it exhausting is not the adjustment itself. It's the lack of any space where adjustment is not required at all. Because when every environment subtly asks you to become slightly different, even in small ways, you start losing touch with what remains when no one is being accounted for. Not a dramatic loss, not a disappearance, just a quiet distancing from the parts of you that don't need to be shaped for anyone else. And eventually, a strange desire begins to surface underneath all of this. Not the desire to be seen by everyone, not even the desire to be understood by everyone, but simply the desire to exist for once without translation, to speak without scanning the room at the same time, to feel without immediately adjusting the expression of that feeling, to be present in a way that is not simultaneously managing perception. And in those rare moments when that happens, even briefly, it can feel unexpectedly calm. Not because you become someone new, but because for once, you stop leaving yourself behind while trying to meet the room where it is.